Welcome to Liminal Radio. I'm the Hatter.
And I'm Gray. This is the station between stations where we deep dive into the rabbit holes of all your favorite horror topics.
Today, we're talking about my personal favorite topic in horror, angels and demons.
This is going to be a deep dive into religious horror, into angels and demons in folklore, and to the different ways they interact with the horror trope in general. Everything from possessions to living demons walking amongst us, deals with the devil, and all the other great angelic and demonic tropes.
Well, possession is 9/10 of the law.
But bump. Ching! This is the part where a giant cane comes in from off screen and pulls Hatter away.
Sorry, I'm back. Some crazy guy with a cane just ripped me off the screen. Why don't you get us started, Gray?
So, today we're going to be talking about angels and demons, but I do want to specify because it is such a broad topic. We're going to be talking about specifically angels and demons from the Abrahamic religions. So, for people who may not be familiar with that term, the three Abrahamic religions are Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And all three have a really rich history of folklore and belief in various angels and demons. Now, I do want to put a little bit of a disclaimer here that we are talking about folklore, we are talking about fiction, we are talking about horror movies and various tropes. We are not talking about anyone's specific beliefs and endorsing them or criticizing them in any way. So, whatever you may personally believe about angels or demons, that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about culture, we're talking about fiction, and we're talking about the part that angels and demons play in that.
Exactly. You will not hear religion or politics on this channel because that stuff sucks, and we're here to have fun.
Absolutely, because I feel that all of those issues can be so divisive, and one of the amazing things about horror is it's so uniting. Us as horror fans can all get together and really enjoy these kind of topics, this wonderful horror stuff, and angels and demons are such an integral part of that, and I want us to all be able to enjoy that together.
Exactly. So I think it's important that we talk about exactly what a demon is. There's a broad idea of this evil thing with horns and hooves, but it's really a lot more wide than that. There's a lot more types of demons. And in many ways, angels are scarier than demons, but we will get to that. Now, some people like to think that all demons are fallen angels. And if you're looking at the Christian and Abrahamic mythologies, a lot of that is true. But a lot of the times, they're old gods from other religions as well, right?
Absolutely. Whenever we especially look at the names of various different demons, especially if we're kind of looking at like the Solomonic names and the names that get used a lot in quote unquote what we might call modern demonology, a lot of them are the names of Babylonian gods or of Mesopotamian gods or just other pagan gods from kind of the same region as these different Abrahamic faiths. Couple that come to mind from fiction are like Paimon and Pazuzu and other gods that are just they were just gods in other pantheons that then became demons in the Abrahamic pantheons.
So, as per usual, religions taking ideas from other religions and sometimes from pop culture as well.
Absolutely. And while it's really common to think of demons as fallen angels, there's also a lot of other origins for them. For instance, in Islam, the jinn, which most people are familiar with from the genie trope, but the actual jinn are quite a bit different than that. They tend to be more of these elemental original beings that existed at the same time that Allah created the angels. Some would say that Allah created them. Some would say that they existed before he created them. That's kind of a little bit iffy. I will say I am not an Islamic scholar, so if anyone listening to this wants to correct me and kind of get the knowledge right of what some of this stuff is actually going on with that, that is not my strong suit. So I will say I'm open to correction on that. But the jinn in general tend to be these beings of smokeless fire. They tend to be the foes of angels. There's even some folklore where they lived in holes. Another term you hear for Islamic demons is ifrit. And I feel like in pop culture, ifrits are more associated with elements, the wind, lightning, fire, and things like that. But in reality, at least as far as the stuff I've consumed, they tend to more just be a lesser form of demon than the jinn. Jinn tend to be more the ones that have the trope of being forced to serve, and the jinn having to serve a master is where the concept of genies come from. One of the more interesting depictions of jinn that we do have in media is Wishmaster series, where they very much meld the jinn and genie ideas, and it makes a really great horror movie. And when we get to angels and demons in movie and general pop culture, we're going to talk about that movie more because I love that movie.
My grandmother was a really big fan of those movies. I remember watching a few of them with her. I didn't like them when I was younger, but I came to appreciate them more as an adult.
I do feel like they have a lot of strong points and a lot of weak points, but I definitely feel like they overall are just super interesting and have a lot to offer and are, in my opinion, highly underrated.
Yeah, a lot of those movies from that era really are because I think at the time when those movies came out, we didn't have as much of a concept of so bad it's good as we do now. And I think it got a lot of flack because it was under that umbrella and a lot of people just didn't know how to have fun.
Also, Wishmaster was a little late for its time. It was actually a contemporary of, like, the first Scream movie. So it was a movie that just came into its own a little late because by that time, horror had moved on to more of a meta horror format.
And that's actually a really good point because even until she said that, I had forgotten how late those movies happened because they feel like an early 80s movie when in reality, like she said, they were contemporary with Scream.
Yeah, so around the mid 90s or so forth.
Yeah, they were great, they just didn't find their audience because they were a more of a demon slasher kind of movie, and that just by that point, everybody was so tired of them that it just went unnoticed, which is a shame because a lot of them are gems, and I personally like the last one, but that's just because I find the whole thing of the Jinn trying to be lovable hilarious.
Is a likability problem.
Now, I feel like we're going to end up focusing a lot on Christian folklore and the Christian depiction of angels and demons because that's what you see in modern media so much. But before we jump into that, I do want to mention the fact that Judaism has a lot of really interesting depictions of demons and concepts around demons and angels. And that gets meshed together with Christianity a lot because, of course, most of the Christian Old Testament is a lot of the Jewish Bible. They don't have everything in common, but they're very close. But the folklore is also there and kind of separate. And one of the things you have to talk about when you're mentioning demons in Judaism is Lilith and her origin and what a Lilith is in Jewish folklore. Lilith is what a biblical scholar might call a post biblical innovation, which means the plain text of either the Torah or the Christian Old Testament doesn't actually have her in it. She exists because the book of Genesis has two different accounts of how humans were created. In one of them, the man was created first, and then the woman was created later out of his rib, being Eve. In the other version, man and woman are created at exactly the same time. And these do, of course, don't match. You can't have it both ways. And so, what a lot of Jewish folklore and Jewish folk tradition did was to say, okay, well, yes, but the woman who was created second is Eve, and this woman who was created first was actually Adam's first wife, known as Lilith. And then they created an entire story about how, for various reasons, she was kicked out of the garden first. And sometimes this was for acts of disobedience, sometimes this was for pride, various unwomanly characteristics, being a bad wife. And either way, she went out into the wilds that were outside of the Garden of Eden and is often considered a mother of monsters and a mother of demons and things like that.
And see, that's why I like Lilith better. She's just cooler.
I feel like in modern culture, Lilith has kind of been adopted as a image of female empowerment. She's the woman who could not be controlled by Adam.
I'm just a fan of anybody who is oh, what's the word? I don't want to say a rebel, but just doesn't do what they're told. So yeah, I guess a rebel.
My anti-authoritarian heart absolutely agrees with that. Anyone not doing what they're told properly is always going to resonate with me.
All hail the contrarians.
Indeed. So that's Lilith. And she of course shows up in Has Been Hotel. We're gonna be talking about Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss a lot because it's my favorite thing ever.
And I feel like it, while not itself directly explicit horror, definitely has horrifying elements. And 100% you cannot talk about the modern perception of angels and demons without talking about the whole Vizia Pop universe.
Indeed. Plus it's great.
And it's just a really damn good show, both of them.
So, we will get there. The first thing I want to mention is I remember quite some time ago as I was reading up on this, somebody had like some very close exact count of how many angels and demons there are. I couldn't find that. I don't know the exact number, so I'm not even going to lie to you guys, but it's a lot. In the early stories about the fallen angels, apparently one third, quote, one third of the stars fell from the sky. So, as many angels as there were one third as many demons.
Which is really interesting to pick specifically the idea of a third, because of course the number three is highly significant in all kinds of mysticism. So one third of the angels becoming demons is really relevant because, again, that's the one third, the Trinity, 3 days. It's just a very important number. So it's very significant that that one was chosen.
And you know what's divisible by three?
What's that?
Six. Six, six. The number of the beast. Sorry.
There's actually a really interesting discussion going on TikTok periodically, largely around Dan McClellan and his interpretation that the number of the beast has nothing to do with the devil or even this post apocalyptic Revelation era, and that it actually had more to do with Nero. Because I don't know how many people know at the time that the book of Revelations was written. The main fear of a lot of Christians was that the Emperor Nero was going to return from the dead or from exile. There were a lot of people who didn't believe he was dead, and that he was going to return, persecute Christians, and just generally start a hellacious period in Rome, so that the number 666 numerically actually represents the name of the Emperor Nero.
Wasn't burning down Rome enough for the guy?
Well, apparently he wanted to come back and finish the job.
I can respect that. I respect a completionist.
Achievement. You have fiddled while Rome burned. Ding!
So, as we know, a common archetype for the demon is the fallen angel, and I think it is important to mention a few important names in the demonology handbook. Many of them show up in Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss. Didn't I say we were going to mention that? First and foremost, though, let's talk about the devil. What do you think of the devil?
That is a loaded question considering I live in the South. But but I find it to be such an interesting central folklore concept.
I agree 100%. Like, there's so many ideas. There's so much mystery behind this idea of, quote, the devil, Satan, Lucifer. We don't even know if he was Lucifer. It might even just be a title. But we'll get more into that. I'm sorry. What were you saying?
The devil is so interesting because he's depicted in so many different ways. Almost as many times as the devil is depicted, that's how many different kinds of depictions there are. Everything from him almost being fey-like, this type of creature that lives at crossroads and can be repelled by folk magic, all the way to the more servant of God that's just in opposition, sort of like a prosecuting attorney like we see in the book of Job. So he's depicted in so many different ways, and you bring up a really interesting idea with even the names are not super consistent because Satan or Shaitan is just adversary. Lucifer actually just means the shining one and was originally a title for Aphrodite. It was a term used to describe Aphrodite or Venus before it was ever used to describe the devil in the Bible.
Oh, yeah. And both names appear a lot throughout history, particularly Lucifer. But yeah, the interesting thing about that title, Satan or Shaitan, if you're speaking, or Shaitan, however you say it in Islamic tradition, he's known as Shaitan. But what it actually means is, as you said, it means adversary. It can also mean accuser. So, an interesting thought, and thought to be one of the first angels to fall, Samael, may be the one that they're referring to because he was called Samael the accuser or the judge.
Absolutely. There's so much of these different ideas about the possible identity. There's even a lot of thought that these are not all meant to be the same person, that Samael, Lucifer, Satan, they're often depicted as being different entities that all exist at the same time. And one place where at least I am personally theorizing that these two names may be used to depict different people is in back to Hell of a Boss and Has Been Hotel. In Has Been Hotel, we meet Lucifer. We see Lucifer, and that is his name. However, we have not met the similar character in Hell of a Boss yet, and that character's name is Satan. We specifically do hear him referred to as Satan. No one ever mentions Lucifer. I'm not sure whether these are meant to be two names for the same person, but I personally theorize these are going to be two very different characters, which of course makes sense because these are two very different series, but I think they're going to be different guys. So we have a depiction of Satan and Lucifer not being the same guy.
Yeah, I do remember in the one episode that it took them an entire year to get out. It was supposed to be part 2 of the season 1 finale. Beelzebub, who is depicted very differently from the normal, mentions that she has some kind of attraction to Satan when she met him, and then she feels embarrassed because he's kind of like a brother. Now, Lucifer seems like he would be more like a father to these characters or even a boss, right?
Exactly. So I'm kind of personally hoping for the idea that this is going to be a completely separate character.
I think because they're very good. I'm going to say this about the Vizzy Pop universe. They are very good at knowing their folklore and changing it in just such a way that it fits in, but keeping it to where it's supposed to be. My theory is that Satan is going to be Samael.
We 100% know that Lucifer is a fallen angel, but it may be that Satan is a fallen angel and is simply a different fallen angel. So the idea of it being Samael does totally make sense.
Now, if you remember in Has Been Hotel when what's her name? Sarah was talking to Emily. She talks about the way she talks about an angel falling is like it's the worst possible scenario. Like she's real worried about it happening to other people. So really that could go in one of two directions. It could either be that it's only happened to one person or it could be that it's a common thing throughout history. We really don't know.
And actually using Hell of a Boss to circle back to our outline as we often need to do. They did such a great job in Hell of a Boss of actually using named demons that have their own folkloric history. Because, as you mentioned, we see Beelzebub often called the Lord of Flies, but in this case is more associated with bees than flies. We also see Osmodius, which is more of a, in this case, is depicted as a lust demon and is actually turned into sort of a rooster, which I find a really cool sort of double entendre.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, and just a note, Beelzebub also could mean Lord of Things That Fly. So, bees do fly, kinda.
It was finally proven that they do fly. They just had to completely redo all the math.
And the idea there was that supposedly scientists believed that it was mathematically impossible for bumblebees to fly.
But their math was probably just wrong, right?
They just didn't understand all the mechanics involved.
Oh, that makes sense too. See, for me, it's usually that my math is wrong. That's a pretty common occurrence over here.
My math is wrong more often than it's right. If I do not have a calculator in my hand, I'm just going to say something like, sounds like about 350.
You remember when we were all in school and our teachers told us we wouldn't always have a calculator?
I do remember that, and I wish I could go find one of my teachers just to prove them wrong and just throw my phone at them.
Yeah. But circling back, this is a good segue into our next section of important demons. What are some of the demons that you think of when you think demonology?
Of course, like the ones we've mentioned, there's Beelzebub, Mammon, Osmodius, and we'll kind of get into those a little bit. Now, one of the ones I find really interesting is actually a demon slash pagan god, yet again in that category of gods that were turned into demons, and that's Malak. And Malak is so cool because we don't even know how to pronounce his name.
I'm going to tell you this now. There is much debate as to how many of these names are pronounced. We'll get to them as we go.
Oh, for sure, but him even more so because the way Hebrew and a lot of the other Semitic languages these were originally written in worked is they didn't write down the nouns.
Post note, he meant vowels.
They only wrote down the consonants. So when we call the thing we call Malak was actually just MLK. Theoretically, that could have been milk.
I'm not a big fan of milk.
Well, I'm not a fan of milk, but I'm not certain it's demonic, but I'm not certain it's not. Drinking cow's udder juice just seems weird. I'm not sure it's a great idea.
Yeah. I could see that.
But Malak is really interesting because the way it's often used in folklore and in modern fiction specifically is he is often a child-eating demon, or more specifically, a demon that children are sacrificed to. And I find that just really interesting. Although, an interesting little weird bit of knowledge is that there is a lot of theory that Malak actually didn't refer to even a pagan god. It referred to a type of sacrifice, which was usually a child sacrifice, and that originally the god it was being sacrificed to was the Abrahamic God, that this was actually the God of Israel who was accepting child sacrifice at this time. So that's kind of that's not exactly substantiated, but that's an interesting theory.
Oh yeah, and the Old Testament God, he liked his sacrifices. I'm not gonna even doubt that that might be true. But another interesting idea, you brought up Osmodius. I got a fun little story about that. Me and my brother, when we were playing D&D a while back, we were in an argument as to how the name Asmodeus is pronounced. Asmodeus. He says it's Osmodeus. No, he said it's Asmodeus. I said no, it's Asmodeus. We went back and forth like that for a while. My brother and I really like arguing. This is normal. And finally, we saw on a post that he was going to show up in Hell of a Boss. And I'm like, yeah, we're going to hear someone say it out loud and you're going to see that I'm right. So as you recall, we were arguing whether it was Asmodeus or Asmodeus. And as it pops up on Hell of a Boss, it's Osmodius. And I was like, oh, come on.
Oh, absolutely. And your guess is as good as theirs. It's like the joke from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures about the great philosopher Socrates.
Socrates.
Yeah, Socrates, that guy.
But does he sow crates?
Does he sow crates or does he reap crates?
See, I think this might be for another episode because this is becoming terrifying.
I would just like to end this argument on something completely unrelated. We do not sow.
Do not sow crates. Now, being fans of horror, everybody has their favorite demon. What's your favorite, Gray?
Well, whenever I was originally thinking on what my answer to this question would be, my first thought was, okay, I'm going to come up with one from folklore and then one from fiction. And then I came up with two names and realized they were both from fiction. One was just really, really old fiction, and one was much more modern. So my original demon, the one that, again, I had to remember, oh, that's actually just also from a novel, is Mephistopheles, who is, of course, from the novel Faust, which is, if not the original Deal with the Devil story, it is certainly the most iconic one. Because, and again, I picked him because I love the Deal with the Devil trope. The other, much more modern one is Crowley, the Crossroads demon or the King of the Crossroads from Supernatural. Kind of the same reason, because he has that same deal with the devil trope, but also just that actor is fantastic, and I would watch him recite a laundry list. He's just an amazing actor.
Absolutely. Now, if I have to pick, I'll do what you did. We'll talk one from folklore. I'm personally a big fan of Rom or Rom. I'm not sure which is the proper pronunciation, but we've already, discussed this at length. And, he controls 77 legions of demons. He's an archduke, but the thing I really enjoy about him is that he's represented by a crow, and a crow is my favorite animal. So, spirit animal type thing, spirit demon. Now, if we're talking from, you know what, it's going to be another one from folklore and religion. So I did the opposite thing, but that's okay. I tend to be a big fan of Lucifer. I like the Draculean concept of Lucifer, the, kind of the suave, polite, gregarious version of him rather than the angry one, like kind of like in Supernatural where he was just kind of a bro. I didn't like that depiction.
One of the things that's really fascinating about the depiction of Lucifer in Supernatural is also a little bit of the same thing that causes there to be such a cool interpretation of him in Hell of a Boss. We're kind of going to get to that more later, but I want to touch on it now, which is the idea of design space. Which, if anyone who's not familiar, whenever you're writing a story or drawing a comic book or whatever, when you're creating art, there's such a thing as design space, which means you can only use certain ideas so many times before they become redundant, which means if I have one character who has certain traits, I can't really have another character with those same traits. So I then have to, if I have a character I would normally give those traits to, I now have to come up with new traits for them. In Supernatural, we already had Crowley. Long before we ever met Lucifer, we met Crowley. Crowley is the epitomic devil. He wears black, like you said, he's Draculean. Anyone who doesn't know what we're saying when we say Draculean, go watch our last episode where we discuss vampires and how Dracula became this archetype that a lot of other characters took after. And Crowley has that same energy. And since they had already used up the really cool Draculean devil trope on Crowley, they couldn't use it again on the devil, on Lucifer. So they had to go with, in that case, a lesser version of him, like you said, kind of a bro and just not as good. Whereas the exact opposite happened in Has Been Hotel. In Has Been Hotel, they already used up the classic ideas of the devil on Alistair, the radio demon. He already looks like what you would expect the devil to look like, and he acts like what you would expect the devil to act like. So whenever they went to design their Lucifer, they had to pick something completely different. And when they did that in Hell of a Boss, or excuse me, in Has Been Hotel, they did a fantastic job. They made him bouncy and happy and made him seem more like Charlie's father and made him seem more like a fallen angel. And as such, we got a really cool Lucifer just because they had to explore a new design space.
Now, I've always liked the idea of, and they kind of bake this into him, this idea that he's a visionary. He had his own ideas. He creates duckies. I love that, by the way. And that's the archetype of Lucifer that I really like. The visionary who wanted to do his own thing and got booted out for it, and just said, "Okay, well, I'll start my own kingdom." With you know what, we're not going to make that joke because it's old. But yeah, tell me this: when you think of the Lucifer archetype, what do you think? Is he a dick or is he kind of a nice guy?
I feel like the change in how we feel about Lucifer as he is depicted as the rebellious angel who fell from grace has changed as our personal beliefs about rebels have changed, as the contrarian has gone from being a bad person who refuses to acknowledge proper authority and has more become what we immediately think of as a folk hero. And as such, and of course, me being very anti authoritarian and me being the type of person that loves contrarians, I have to say, I normally, in most depictions, I'm going to end up siding with the devil unless they are explicitly making him really, really horrible, which they often do if they're trying to use him as a source of horror. But if that is in absence, then yeah, I'm always going to kind of side with the contrarian, with the rebel.
I'm definitely the same way. I'm definitely an anti-authoritarian type, and the idea of him just saying, "I don't like the way you're doing things here," and the other guy being like, "Too bad," and him just leaving. I mean, he was booted out in most stories, but who knows? Maybe he just left. Maybe he was just like, "Screw this, man. I'll start my own king."
I always personally loved the Mark Twain Devil from Letters from Earth, which is one of his highly ignored work because it was later after he got really depressed, where Lucifer, what he did get in trouble with God, but he was exiled from heaven for a galactic day. And you get to watch him going from oh, well, it's just a day. I'll, do my time and then all will be forgiven. And you watch as he gets sucked down into the depression pit that is Earth and become more and more spiteful and angry and depressed.
Because even a single galactic day is a near eternity by Earth time.
Oh boy. It's kind of funny though because that trope or that particular idea is also baked into the Has Been Hotel Lucifer because we see that while he's not like morbidly depressed, he does have a bit of that depression going.
Well, if you had to be down with all the assholes in hell, wouldn't you get depressed? There's enough of them here.
I feel like I'd get along with a lot of the people there. If it's anything like Has Been Hotel, I'll get along with a lot of those people.
Well, and the crazy thing and the cool thing about Has Been Hotel is they show heaven's not a lot better. And those people are really horrible too. And that's actually, of course, becomes a major plot point that the angels don't seem to in any way be morally superior to the souls in hell.
And I do. I've always loved that idea because if you really think about it, who's in charge of if we're looking specifically at the religious side of it, who's in charge of the narrative?
Well, I think that that goes back very much to the history is written by the winners kind of idea.
Exactly. The heaven side is in charge of the narrative, so the humans see them as the good guys. So obviously, who's ever writing this stuff is going to say, "Oh, Lucifer was a bad guy," because he disagreed with the boss, and it's going to depict one side as bad and one side as good, and even to an extent to where they probably believe their own propaganda. We're good guys. We're doing what we have to do. But as we know, according to Has Been Hotel anyway, they're not the good guys. They're very much the bad guys.
One thing I do wonder what they're going to do in Has Been Hotel is are we ever going to see God, or is it going to be kind of a godless heaven system, which we do see in a lot of places, which they use as just a neat way to sidestep the idea of having to depict God in any way, because that's often kind of really thorny territory.
It's funny because I've had this exact discussion, and they even seem to acknowledge it within universe. Although this was in the Hell of a Boss pilot, what's his face? Blitz says something like Christ on a stick. I guess there is a God. So apparently there is some debate to that.
One thing I feel like we have to address, since we are discussing Hell of a Boss and Has Been Hotel right now, is the fact of screw whoever actually hacked them and leaked the entire second season.
Wait, they did?
Yeah, the entire second season, almost entirety, has been hacked, and Pop is practically dying of depression right now because their entire storyline is out there for anyone who is not careful enough to avoid the spoilers.
We need to figure out who this was and say some really mean stuff to them.
I personally hope they get herpes in their eyeballs.
I hope that they stub their toe every day and step in a puddle and have to deal with wet socks all day. I don't know which is worse.
I'm going with the romantic thriller option and hope they sleep forever in a mattress soaked with cat pee.
That's the worst one.
By far. That horrifies me just by its existence and implication.
Do we know when season 2 is supposed to come out?
We didn't even have a release date, but we now have all the storyboards. We have multiple songs released. I am not going to mention any plot points, not only because of spoilers and I don't want to spoil it for people, but I am not propagating any of this because I believe people who do these kind of hacks and spoils for people, they are ruining the art, they are ruining the fun for everyone, and they should get no reward, no satisfaction. So even though, yes, unfortunately, I do now know some of the very major plot points that are going to be happening next season, we are not going to be discussing them at all.
Absolutely not, because I don't even know. Let me say this. I just want to do a bit of an appreciation post here. Pop, that whole group, they work very hard. You can see that they put so much effort and so much attention into what they write. There's so much attention to detail and so much love for what they do. I don't know if any of them are going to actually end up hearing this, but I just want them to know they're doing great. They're doing really, really great. I love everything they've put out. I won't be looking up the spoilers, and I cannot wait for season 2. And I can't wait for the next episode of Hell of a Boss either, because the last episode was friggin' phenomenal.
Absolutely. Pop, if you ever hear this, and I like to fantasize that one of these days you might, I just want you to know that I am so glad that your weird Tumblr Bible fanfic made it to an actual show, and you got to have the dream of all fanfic authors of actually getting to make it. I'm so happy for you.
And I don't know what Tumblr is, but me too. But anyway, we should probably circle back rather than, this whole fanning out thing. We were talking about important demons, and we were talking about that before. But I kind of want to talk about a few that show up in Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss, since we're on that sort of wavelength here.
Absolutely.
Now, we mentioned a few. We mentioned, of course, Lucifer, who their depiction is just phenomenal. We mentioned Beelzebub, and they changed. And see, this is one of those scenarios wherein I say, and this was in Hell of a Boss, they made some changes to the idea because typically Beelzebub is depicted often as male, often as being like this fat, disgusting thing. Being fat is not disgusting. I'm fat myself. Let me be clear on that. But this kind of fat, gross thing surrounded by flies and rot that constantly eats. And they kind of shifted it more towards a party culture idea where, it's more about drinking and having fun. And it kind of even opens up the idea of what gluttony is because it's not just eating. Gluttony is overindulging in just about anything.
Exactly. And for people who are kind of trying to picture what Beelzebub is often depicted as, if you're at all familiar with Warhammer 40K, Grandpa Nurgle, that is normally your Beelzebub.
Yeah, pretty much, pretty much. And I love what they did with that because when I first heard that that character was going to be introduced, I didn't know anything about it. I still have no idea who Kesha is. I know they're really excited to have her on the show, but I really like the flip flop they did there, and they seem to do that a lot. They seem to flip flop things a lot, but somehow they always keep things close to what the source material says.
Well, I love how they always have one foot in the source material. Everything that they do actually does have a basis in it, and then they feel totally free to take it in a really interesting direction.
100%. That's exactly what I was trying to say, and you said it way more succinctly. But who else do we see? We see a lot of characters, of course, from the Ars Goetia. For those of you who don't know, if you've watched Hell of a Boss, you know that that's the name of Stolas's family. That was one of Solomon's books, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And the Goetia, if you haven't ever really seen a picture of them, you may actually have seen a picture of them even if you don't think you have, because if you've ever seen a medieval drawing of a weird looking owl wearing a crown with really long legs, that's Stolas. That's his people. That's the Goetia.
That's another one they did a great job with. And again, they know their stuff. Stolas is a prince in the Ars Goetia. I'm pretty sure they say that he is Pymon's son, right?
Yeah, they have him be Pymon's son. And again, Pymon is depicted in a really interesting way because Pymon is depicted in most folklore as having kind of being a father of infinite amounts of demons, and they even do discuss that in the show, talking about he doesn't even know which kid he's talking to. I also love the little touch where they make him a shapeshifter, where he almost goes through a Rolodex of shapes until he settles on looking like Stolas while he is with Stolas.
Yeah, they definitely, and they always do a really good job with design. There's definitely, I don't want to go on a whole Vivzy Pop rant here again, but there's this art style that they have, that whole studio that kind of reminds me of Invader Zim and stuff like that, but it is in its own way, it's its own thing. And they always seem to understand the folklore very well when they design these characters. They know, and the great thing is they can make these changes and still keep it. And I know I keep saying this, but still keep it firm to the folklore. And I can't really even express how impressed I am by that. As somebody who, since I was like 11 years old, has loved demonology and angelology. I hate that word, but it's the only word we've got for it. And myth about, heaven and hell and demons and devils. That's why this became my favorite thing. That's why anything by Vivzy Pop became my favorite thing, because she did a whole different take on it and yet kept it firm to the source material.
You mentioned Invader Zim, and I want to throw a really interesting factoid at you that the voice for Moxie is the voice for Invader Zim. Same guy.
I bet you I can top that one.
What you got?
Now, you're familiar with the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, right?
Correct.
So the co-creator of the Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, the main writer and stuff, Maxwell Adams, was also in Hell of a Boss.
And who was he in Hell of a Boss?
In the first episode in Murder Family, he played the father. And the second episode, when they're at Lululand and he meets the mascot and calls him a pervert, bam, Maxwell Adams.
That's awesome.
I love that. I love how like all this stuff, and that's another reason I love it. It's just all this stuff from my childhood coming together, all my favorite things. We're gonna get back to the outline because I could really gush about how great Vivzy Pops is all day. But where were we?
Exactly. We got to circle back to the outline. I'm sure we will touch on more Vizzy Pop stuff, more Hell of a Boss and Has Been Hotel.
Definitely.
But we're going to try to talk about other things other than that because, again, I feel like we could do an entire show just on that subject.
And we probably will someday. So the next thing I had on my list, we talked about important demons. We talked about who Lucifer is, what he is. We talked about who Lucifer is, what he is. And I want to talk kind of about origins of demons. We got into that a little bit. We talked about fallen angels, but throughout different cultures, they're a little bit different. Now, we talked a bit about origins and ideas of what demons are, most commonly fallen angels, but there's a lot of different ideas that kind of inform their tropes. One great example is the Fae, because we see some undeniable parallels there. What do you think about that, Gray? I know you know a lot about the Fae.
Absolutely. The Fae and that general Celtic folklore is one of my favorite subjects. And what we currently think of as demons and the devil is highly influenced by by our understanding of old fairy folklore and fae folklore, which are the same thing, just different ways of saying fae, fairy, fairy. One of my favorite things is that it needs to have an F and it needs to have an R, and then you just add vowels with your heart. Fairy, fae, fairy, fair, just anything like that. Just whatever moves you in the moment.
Foo Fighters.
Exactly, it's all good.
Yeah, that might be a different thing, but continue.
Because there are so many elements that the Fae share with demons. For one, is anything having to do with crossroads, again, is a very Fae element. Anything having to do with true names, because this is another element that if you know a fairy's name, you have power over it. If a fairy knows your name, he can steal your name or use it to in some way influence you or control you. And the same thing of this is something that's given to demons. Now, of course, it's present in other cultures. True names were very important in Egypt, so it's not strictly Fae, but because a lot of America has a lot of immigrants from Celtic cultures, especially Appalachia and that kind of American mountain culture where a lot of our demon devil folklore comes from, because those cultures are heavily influenced by Ireland, by Scotland, by all these different Celtic cultures. That's why we get a lot of that fairy DNA in our demons. That's also where some of the things about deals, going to the devil to make a deal, kind of in the same way that in fairy culture, in fairy folklore, you would go to the fairies to make a deal, say to grant you fertility if you couldn't have a kid. A lot of these deal with the devil ideas started off as fairy deals and then became something else once Christianity took over these stories.
Absolutely. And like one major trope I want to talk about that shows up with this is of course the idea of knowing a demon's name. Because that seems to come a lot from the Fae, but there's this idea that if you know a demon's name, you have control over it. You can command this, this, and that. Now, according to Solomon, you not only needed to know its name, but you had to also invoke the name of God. We'll get to that a bit later. But what do you think about the true name thing?
I love that as a trope. For one, it leads to great storytelling because it gives you a way to give your hero a way to fight this demon who normally they couldn't fight. Suddenly they find out the name through a clever bit of storytelling. You give them the true name. Now all of a sudden they're on equal footing. I would like to point out that most people are actually very intimately familiar with a fairy story, specifically a fairy tale pertaining to getting power over someone by learning their true name, and that's going to be Rumpelstiltskin. And anyone who's not familiar, for like the five people who may not know the story of Rumpelstiltskin, a fairy named Rumpelstiltskin shows up, makes a deal with a woman so that she can spin straw into gold in exchange for her firstborn child. Then, when he comes to get the child, she is basically given the thing that if she can guess his name, she'll be able to banish him and no longer have to honor her deal. Tries guessing his name, can never guess his name. Finally, her servant woman sneaks around, finds out what his real name is, which is, of course, Rumpelstiltskin. She tells him that his name is Rumpelstiltskin, and he stomps so hard he rips himself in half.
So you're telling me that this guy's name wasn't Rumpled Foreskin?
No, he did not, as far as I know, have a rumpled foreskin.
Oh, imagine that. See, so I play a lot of video games and I have gone into some legendary rages, but I have never separated one part of my body from the other doing it. I'm almost impressed here.
One of the older versions that I've also heard is he just stomped so hard he exploded, which I also just really love the mental image of.
Oh, that I have done.
Thanks to Hatter's amazing healing abilities, he was able to put himself back together, much like that one time that Wolverine was atomized and held together in a red mist by Jean Grey long enough to come back together.
Wild stuff there for sure.
One of these days, we are definitely going to get into horror in comic books. That is just such a rich treasure trove of topics.
I think we'll do that soon too, actually. But the true name idea shows up pretty much everywhere. It's a thing in Warhammer. You know, there's demons in Warhammer. You know, you got guys like Slanesh, you got guys like Korn. Yes, his name is Korn. The true name idea shows up there. And one other thing I noticed is that we don't know the name of the being that shows up to Job in the Bible story. We all know that story, right?
Exactly. And anyone who may not be familiar with the Bible story of Job, Job is a very righteous man that God is kind of challenged by Satan, by this adversary, to test his faith to see if he really is as good as God believes that he is. And so God starts doing all this horrible thing, blights all his cattle, kills all his kids, just does this really horrendous stuff to him, leaves him sitting there in his own filth and disease and boils. And because he remains faithful, he eventually gets everything back. God proving that Job really was as faithful as God believed he was, and that this is an entire kind of almost like a bet between God and this adversary, Satan, who is much more depicted not as an enemy of God, but as more like a co being who is involved in the running of the universe with him.
Yeah, and let me just say, I'm so glad that what happened to Job happened before they invented PTSD, because dear God, no pun intended.
And even more horribly, there is a lot of belief that the oldest versions, because of course everything in the Old Testament was held as an oral tradition before it was written down. And there's a lot of people who believe that the original version of that story was not where Job gets everything back at the end. It was where he was literally left laying on the ground, completely penniless, with everyone he knows dead, still praising the name of God. And that was his reward.
You know, it's a good thing they also hadn't invented Stockholm Syndrome yet.
I actually have an entire thing on Stockholm Syndrome, and I'm not sure what episode that's going to go in, but I'm going to cram it into some episode because the concept of Stockholm Syndrome is fascinating and that it's kind of rooted in sexism, but we're going to do that in a different episode.
Yeah, I would say so. But on the note of this thing being like a kind of counterbalance helping God run the universe, we know more often than not, an angel or angels are depicted as the good guys, demons are depicted as the bad guys. But it's really even in mythology and in the Bible and in all those holy books, it's not often quite that way, is it?
Oh, no, absolutely not. Angels are often depicted as terrifying. Angels are often carrying out the wrathful work of God. There is a reason why angels often begin by saying, "Be not afraid." One thing that's become a huge thing in folklore, well, I say folklore, in common modern pop culture now, is to have the quote unquote biblically accurate angels. Now, the subject of biblically accurate angels is really cool and it's kind of its own thing. And it's nice how modern pop culture has kind of embraced this idea that the way angels are depicted in the Bible is as much scarier. And the answer in the Bible is that they're kind of depicted a bunch of different ways. And I know one of the things you're going to talk about here in a minute is how there are so many different kinds of angels, levels of angels, and types of angels. But what is often meant when people say, quote unquote, biblically accurate angels is depicting these thrones, these principalities, these seraphim, these cherubim, who are sometimes depicted as like spinning wheels of fire covered in eyes, or as having three heads and six wings, and sometimes animalistic qualities. So angels are often, in their own way, almost like cosmic horrors. So they almost have a Lovecraftian feel to them.
Absolutely. You already know I have an opinion on this. I hate when people say biblically accurate angels for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, as you said, it implies that the more humanoid ones are not biblically accurate. And I'm telling you right now, the lowest choir of angels, the lowest of the three sets, are very much humanoid. And they're more often than not the ones that appear to humans. And at the end of the day, it's not just Bible accurate. You got to say folklore accurate because these ideas come from a lot more than just the Bible.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that when we're saying the word angel, that is a translation of a word that literally just means messenger. It is used to mean human messengers as well. So when we're saying angel, we're not so much referring to a species or a type of thing, we're referring to a job. So this could be any number of different entities that are given the job of bringing a message.
That makes perfect sense to me. So, what do you think? Should I go over a quick crash course on the choirs?
Absolutely. Let's have an entire angel breakdown.
Okay, so as I said, the idea of Bible accurate angels, I hate that phrase because, again, they all look very different from each other. And I'm actually going to relate this back. What am I going to relate this to? I'm sure you can guess, Gray.
I'm going to make a wild guess and say Has Been Hotel.
Has Been Hotel, because a lot of them are mentioned. Well, a lot of them are depicted and mentioned throughout Has Been Hotel. But there are three choirs. The lowest choir of angels would be angels, and they're actually just called angels, archangels, which are kind of their leaders, and then principalities, which are kind of their leaders. Angels speak directly to humans for the most part. This is the choir that is most commonly the ones who are sent to speak to humans for obvious reasons we'll get to in a minute. So if we go back to Has Been Hotel, we can kind of see all of them there. Maybe I'm reaching a little bit, I'm not sure. But if you look, the exorcists are the ones that are dealing with mortals. And you have all the nameless ones that, nobody ever talks about and they're just kind of there fighting, making sounds. Those would be to me the angels. Now, there are their leaders who would be, second in command to principalities. Now, in the actual lore, a principality, put it this way, in the actual lore, angels talk to humans. Archangels kind of lead them and tell them what they're doing. Principalities lead entire nations and entire armies. But if we're talking Has-Been Hotel, you have the basic angels, you have the archangels, who I would probably equate to Lute because she seems to be in a higher position than any of them. Adam's right hand, kinda. And then Adam, in this case, would be the principality. Now, I'm not even going to get into what I think Adam is in Has-Been Hotel because that's kind of confusing right now. But that's that choir. That is the earthly choir of angels.
And there's a couple of interesting things about depictions, because I'm going to go back to Has Been Hotel a little bit too here. With we visually see, like specifically during the trial scene, we visually see some really interesting depictions of what some of these angels look like. And some of them visually look like they are depicting things like cherubim, seraphim. They have different types of heads. We actually do see one of the wheels with eyes. So we do see this varied type of representation. Now, they don't tell us who they are. We don't know if this is more of an earthly choir or if this is just meant to be literally everyone in heaven showed up for this. We do know that Sarah is probably a seraphim. We can guess that from her name, and she does have the multiple wings, so that is probably who she's meant to be. Now, one thing that I do want to mention Has Been Hotel's version of that does also kind of bring up the interesting that does bring up the two different schools of thoughts. In Has Been Hotel, at least some angels used to be human souls. And there are some folklore that believe angels did used to be humans, or at least some angels used to be humans. Whereas there is other folklore, 100% angels were created by God. They are completely different and separate than human souls. Actually, one of the weird places where you will find more of a human souls now angels is actually with Mormons. Mormons believe a lot in these human souls who become angels. And if you watched our last episode, you would actually know how that ties into the Twilight vampires. But I just wanted to, and we don't want to go into Twilight any more than we have to. We did that last episode. We don't have to this episode, so we won't. But I will just say that I do like that there are different folklores that show human souls as being related to angels, and then others that show them as being two completely separate things.
Exactly. And, because I'm still washing the filth off from talking about Twilight, we're just going to move ahead to the next group. See, they're kind of in three groups of angels. There's the low group, the earthly group. Then there's the group that's between heavenly and earthly that consists of angels called powers, virtues, and dominions. Now, powers fight against evil on earth, and not humans, something a little higher but not quite of heavenly scale. Evil spirits, that sort of thing. The chief of them is thought to be Samael, which I keep bringing him up. He's one of my favorites, which is why he's considered to be the judge or the accuser. Right above them is virtues, and this is also mentioned in Has Been Hotel. There's a scene where Adam's sitting there talking to Charlie, I believe it was, and he says something to the effect of when he was in a rock band, there was some virtue chick that was after his drummer and should have been after him. That was his words, not mine. So I don't know how many people actually caught that. I did. I was kind of proud of myself for that. But virtues are, quote unquote, they call them spirits of motion. They control elements, they control the seas, they control weather, things like that. They're kind of elemental beings, if you will. Now, I don't have a description in my mind of what each of these would look like. Samiel is often depicted as humanoid, so I assume powers are just that, somewhat humanoid. Virtues, I imagine something humanoid, but more aligned with its element. So, if it controls water, it might be blue, so on and so forth.
And if they are specifically designed, as the folklore is suggesting here, to kind of oppose the unclean spirits on earth, then we can kind of assume that they might be similar to what they're opposing. Because I picture when they're talking about these spirits they're opposing, I'm picturing like Legion from the Bible, which again is the story where Jesus casts an evil spirit out of a person who is being possessed by it and into a herd of pigs, and that is very much a unclean spirit that I think when they're talking about the spirits these virtues are meant to oppose, I picture that's what they're talking about. So I find it kind of interesting that they might be sort of like the things they are designed to oppose.
I'm sorry if my wording was no good. Powers eliminate evil spirits, virtues control the element.
Oh, I had that completely backwards, but we'll leave that in just so people can know that I am perpetually confused.
It's all words, it's fine. But above the virtues are the dominions, which, as their name would imply, they're kind of like managers. They actually directly know what God's commands for these beings are and kind of delegate it to them. So they're kind of like the regional manager of the choir between earth and heaven. This next choir is the one that you think of when people say Bible accurate angel. This choir includes the angels that directly commune with God. This includes thrones, or in Hebrew folklore, they're called Ophanim. It's the big wheel of eyes you've seen before, big and gigantic. They're kind of like vehicles. They bring lower life forms to commune with God. They're required for it. They're kind of a bouncer, if you will. Now, cherubim are really, really odd creatures. Now, when you think cherub, it does mean childish one. That's what it means, or young one, or something like that. And you might think about the cherubs from Hell of a Boss. Now, that's not really how they were depicted in the Bible. These are creatures with four heads. They got a goat head, they got a human head, and a whole, two other heads. They're also one of the ones that directly speak with God, and they have knowledge of God. So they're kind of the guys that know God. They're close to the throne, and they're kind of, if they have to disseminate information about him, they probably come from those guys. Now, seraphim, this is the other one that people often think of when they think Bible accurate angel. We're talking about a humanoid creature with six or more wings, eyeballs all over the wings. Two of the wings cover its face, two of the wings covered its feet. I guess feet are kind of sacred or something. I don't know. There's some story behind that. I don't know it. Seraphim actually translates to burning ones, and these are the angels that are the closest to God. And these are kind of God's warriors. These things are what you might think when you think cosmic horror, something that could swing a sword. An entire nation of people is just disintegrated in a second.
And one character that's in this choir of angels that I love when it's depicted and is often treated as kind of a foil and sometimes as a stand in for God is Metatron, which is not present in every folklore, but Metatron literally means next to the throne and is often treated as the voice of God, as the angelic right hand of God. That's often a character I really like seeing depicted.
Oh yeah, when it's described in a lot of the folklore, one of my favorite descriptions I've heard is that apparently the thing is covered in mouths and it speaks in a bunch of different voices at once, which sounds super creepy. But it's kind of something I want to see. Who do I talk to about that?
We'll see if we can get you a Ouija board and find someone for you to contact.
Cool, cool. So that's a quick description of the choirs of angels. We may in a future episode go a little bit more in depth about who they are. But can I just talk about real quick one thing in Has Been Hotel that really bothered me?
Absolutely.
This is going to be nitpicky, I know. But when Emily introduces herself to Charlie, she says, "I'm the other seraphim." Seraphim is plural. It's plural. You wouldn't say the other seraphim unless you were talking about more than one. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That's the only bad thing I will ever say about Vivzy Pop's work.
Now, one thing, since we're talking about angels, I do want to jump into pop culture and movies and talk about a movie where we actually get to see angels be the horror movie villains, and that's The Prophecy from the 80s.
Yeah, I still need to watch that. I'm sorry. I know you've been wanting me to.
So, listeners, if you've never watched it, it's a horror movie from the 80s where essentially after you have the first angelic war where Lucifer and the demons fell, you have a second civil war amongst the angels. And so now you have Gabriel, who is one of the angels, who now wants to destroy all humanity because he is jealous of God's love for humans. That's the overarching idea of the entire prophecy series. The really interesting thing about this series is Gabriel, the evil angel, is played by Christopher Walken. And he plays a non-human, creepy-ass angel into just absolute perfection. Within 5 seconds of him walking on screen, he has licked a table. This dude is just absolutely off the wall, batshit in his performance, and it could not be more perfect. They do a great job in Prophecy of making angels just seem so alien, so inhuman, and his acting, well, if it even is acting, because he may or may not even be human, but he does such a fantastic job with Gabriel and making him so creepy. And I also want to throw in, if you need another reason to watch this movie, the devil does show up as being the original rebel, being the original leader of the rebellious angels, and he is played by Viggo Mortensen. That is Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. So you get to see Aragorn be the devil. If you get to see Aragorn be the devil and Christopher Walken be an angel, I have no clue what else you could possibly want out of a movie.
Christopher Lloyd as Fester. Oh wait, we got that.
Actually, just throwing Christopher Lloyd as God in this series, and I'll be totally happy.
Yep, I can agree with that. So we did talk a bit about how angels kind of interact with humans. We didn't talk much about how demons interact with humans. And there's a rich history of folklore and ideas there. Ideas like communication with them, possession. There's quite a bit to talk about that there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. We see demons being shown interacting with people pretty much as far back as we see demons being depicted at all. And one of the major things we see is demons possessing humans, demons cursing humans, and we see demons often being used as sort of an allegory for mental health and for disease in general. Of course, one of the first places we see demonic possession is in the story in the Bible of Legion, which we have talked about already a little bit in this podcast, but we're going to go a little more in depth here, where we have a demon that has possessed a person, and Jesus comes to help cure them of this demon. And in doing so, he talks to the demon. The demon reveals that his name is I am Legion, for I am many, or we are Legion, for we are many. And then Jesus exorcises this demon and casts it out into a herd of pigs, and the herd of pigs runs into the water and is drowned. And a lot of these unclean spirits that we see being cast out in the Bible, if we look at the symptoms with a modern eye, we absolutely see that these are just unhealthy people. These are people with mental illnesses, with physical illnesses, and that they are using the demons as a way of explaining why they have these illnesses.
Yeah, through modernized, that's what they say. Through slightly less modernized, they say there's ghosts in your blood, do cocaine about it.
And I absolutely find it wild that that was not a weird practice not that long ago. Although, in all honesty, I think if more people could do cocaine about it, they probably would.
Yeah, from what I understand, the stuff's pretty addictive.
Well, one of the wildest things is they have actually almost gone full circle. They are now giving people ketamine to treat depression. And I am sorry, I'm sure there's some good science behind that, but the only thing I can think of is, wow, give me Special K and I won't be sad anymore either.
Yeah, you won't feel much of anything, as if I understand it correctly.
They call it a K-hole for a reason. And we're leaving all that in. That's going to be a fantastic joke because my wife is over here about to pee herself. She's laughing so hard.
I was listening to a damn thing you said. I'm laughing at my game.
Oh, okay. Never mind. Well, then we don't have any confirmation that it's that funny, but it is that funny.
It was pretty funny. But yeah, there's definitely a long history of people seeing illness and automatically saying, "Oh, you got demons, you got ghosts. We have to drain some of your blood because your humors are off." But I think medicine, old school medicine like that, is a whole episode that we can do in the future because that's ripe territory.
Oh, absolutely. The horror of early medicine and almost tying that into asylums, how that was kind of a similar thing, because both the early medicine's way of treating the body and early medicine's way of treating the mind were both absolutely horrific. So that's ripe for an entire episode all by itself.
Exactly. But circling back, we have a few vectors through which demons commonly travel. You mentioned the Ouija board, and of course, we also have people messing around with the unknown, just basically not knowing what they're doing. Also ties back into the Ouija board. Seances and summonings, rock music. Seriously, rock music.
The whole idea of playing a rock song backwards and hearing a message from the devil was really big in the 80s. I know if you're not from the 80s right now, if you're too young and don't remember that, that sounds bizarre, but that was 100% something people believed at the time.
And just a side note, it's kind of ridiculous because you know how hard it is to make something sound coherent going forwards and then code a message into it going backwards. Trust me, these rock stars were not willing to put that much work in. They were more focused on if it sounded good.
And most of them were probably on too many drugs to be that picky about how their music sounded anyway.
Yeah, I'm pretty surprised Keith Richards is still alive at this point.
I think he is too.
You know what? Maybe he's not alive and he just forgot to die.
Actually, that sounds like a really hardcore metal lyric. I'm not alive, I just forgot to die.
I'm going to scribble that down here. I'm totally not stealing it. But what do you think about these things? The Ouija boards, what are some of your favorites?
I love using Ouija boards as kind of an explanation because it's something that does legitimately scare people. I work with people that if I were to bust out a Ouija board, they would run screaming from the room because they are convinced it would cause them to be possessed by a demon. That is 100% a thing they would believe in. So that's not like a weird thing the movie's made up. That is a legit belief held by a lot of people. Now, when you talk about kind of what's my favorite way of showing people being possessed by demons and accidentally inviting demons in, I love the seance gone wrong. I love the trope, which we kind of see this in the Conjuring universe a little bit, where we also see it actually even more in the movie Hereditary, where someone intends to speak to a ghost. They are trying to talk to a dead loved one, and what they end up doing instead is talking to or summoning a demon. And I like the idea of demons masquerading as the dead and as your loved ones. I just think that's a super cool trope. That's probably my favorite one.
Yeah, there's an idea like that in a creepypasta I read quite some time ago. And I know you probably know about it. Do you know the creepypasta How to Survive in Hell?
Yes.
So basically, it's just this survival guide where, there's all these people are crazy. There's no animals or plants there, so they have to eat each other, blah, blah, blah. And the only way out is to find forgot how he put it, like a pillar of light and go into it, and it's somebody messing with that stuff, and you'd possess their body and take over their life. That's how he's telling the story. Yeah, and that idea is baked right in there. Like they'll say, "Oh, yeah, I'm your grandma or your great uncle that you wanted to talk to again," and bam, they're back. They're there.
And I love the twist in that story of how it starts off talking about how horrible hell is, but the real horror of the story is the fact that these people who are in hell can now possess you if you start messing with Ouija boards or whatever.
Well, easy solution there. Don't buy a Ouija board.
I literally have a Ouija board that I can see on my shelf from where I sit right now, and the only use I have ever found for it is to mess with my gullible friends, although it is excellent for that.
Yeah, sounds like it. Maybe I have to get one myself.
Get a Ouija board and a gullible friend. They're a great combination.
Absolutely. But yeah, this idea, and let me just, side note there, that idea in the end is that you can't go to heaven in that particular story. That's just what awaits everybody. And we kind of talked about that in the first episode, just the existential horror from that book, Revival. The idea that no, this is just what it is. There's no other alternative. This is just what's going to happen to you.
We need to do an entire episode on afterlives and horror relating to the afterlife. For one, there's about a bajillion movies that relate to this in one way or another, a million books that have to do with it. And it's some of the best scary horror, the best existential horror out there. So that's going to have to be an episode too.
But on a similar subject, we mentioned rock music. We talked a little bit about backmasking. Another kind of interesting thing I wanted to bring up. Dave Mustaine of Megadeth. Do you know Megadeth?
I'm aware of them.
So back in the day, they had these songs that were really dark. Songs like called a song called "The Conjuring." Trying to think of what the other ones were. "The Conjuring" and "Good Morning Black Friday," which both involve possession and are both really, really, really freaking good songs. Now, Dave Mustaine refuses to play those songs anymore because, he converted to Christianity, which is fine. And I kind of just also wanted to say that at one point I remember reading that Dave Mustaine said something to the effect of when he was asked about Rob Halford, he said, "Well, he's gay and the Bible says that's wrong." Dude, you're just jealous he's a better singer than you. You're great on guitar, but yeah, no, Rob Halford's definitely a better singer than Dave Mustaine. I just wanted to get that out.
You wanted that on the record.
I want that on the record. Absolutely. So, we talked a bit about vectors and we talked about how, psychology and demons kind of come together in really, really bad ways. Uh, I'm sure we could talk about more of that in a future episode because trepanation comes to mind, but, future episode.
Well, and while we're definitely going to touch on some of the possession movies, because of course, when you see demons in movies, a lot of times it's possession, which of course, with the OG Exorcist, with Hereditary, with the Exorcism of Emily Rose, with the Pope's Exorcist, with all these different exorcism movies, if we just started talking about all of them, that would be all this episode was about. So we're not going to go like on a super deep dive into all the exorcisms because I feel like exorcism movie is its own episode. Although I do want to touch really briefly on specifically the Exorcism of Emily Rose. And the reason I want to mention that one specifically is, for one, it's based on a real exorcism where a woman who was mentally ill by modern standards, that's definitely what we would call it. And this wasn't like a super long time ago. This was in Germany. And this woman was essentially killed by exorcism. They starved her. They, quote unquote, tortured her until she eventually just died, when in reality, they were trying to save her from the quote unquote demons. And that is who this story is based on, the Exorcism of Emily Rose, which is kind of like a courtroom drama where the priests are being charged with the death of this girl that, again, died during an exorcism. The Exorcism of Emily Rose is so weird because it is depicted that the priests were right, she was possessed, and that her going off to college and becoming worldly and taking, pharmaceuticals for her mental illness is what got her possessed by a demon. And when she came back home, the priests tried their best but could not save her from the worldly demons she had accumulated out on her adventures.
Yeah, no, I 100% believe that happened right off the bat. I have no doubts of that, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. It's a well documented case of the story that it was based on. And the idea of making it into this movie that weirdly had this pro exorcism message, I think was a weird choice.
Yeah, definitely. But those type of people definitely exist in the world, unfortunately. But we're not going to get into religion or politics. So moving along,
I feel like the most religious or political message that we can take away from that is probably rather than trying to cast out demons, at least consider psychological help. We're just going to go with that as our general takeaway.
Yeah, consider that your first step. And if your eyes still glow at night, that means the psychological help isn't happening.
If you find yourself levitating, maybe get a second opinion.
Yeah, well, let's see. Levitation, glowing eyes, speaking backwards Latin when you have no history of ever having spoken Latin. These are the situations where you might want to seek an exorcist rather than a psychological professional.
One thing that's interesting about The Exorcism of Emily Rose is, of course, this is a movie that's in English, and her demon is speaking in German. The really interesting thing about that is that the original case of the girl this is based on is in Germany. So I wonder, did her demon speak in English? I don't actually know, and now I really need to.
Definitely something to look into. On that note, things going into hell and coming out of hell, it's nothing new. It may not have always been called hell, sometimes it was called Hades, but there are some heavy connections to Greek myth we need to talk about before we end out the episode.
Absolutely. Whenever we're talking about Christian demons, we have to keep in mind that Christianity came about in a time when Greek and Roman myth were really big and they were heavily influenced by it. One thing that you mentioned, which is one of your favorite observations, which I totally agree with, is the idea that our concept of Lucifer as this rebel who wanted to help humanity and give them knowledge but was punished for it is closely tied to the Prometheus myth, and I agree with that completely.
Oh, absolutely. And there's obviously a lot of connections. Like a lot of people like to connect the idea of Satan to Hades, but in how they're depicted, there's a lot of differences. But certainly Prometheus bringing fire to Earth, Lucifer brings light to Earth. And it's never said in the Bible or any of the folklore that the snake in the Garden of Eden was Lucifer. That was something that was kind of inferred later on. But the idea, the connection between bringing light, bringing fire, bringing knowledge, there's definitely a Promethean connection there.
Oh, 100%. And I also feel like Hades has heavily impacted how we view the devil because the devil has impacted how we view Hades and vice versa. A lot of times, people who aren't as familiar with Greek folklore will think of Hades as being evil because they connect him to the devil. But also at the same time, we tend to think of the devil as a judge who sits over the dead in hell. And that's not really something we ever see in the Bible. It's really not something we saw in folklore before the influence of Greek or Roman mythology. So Hades himself has influenced how we view the devil and kind of seeing him in this judge of the dead type role.
Absolutely, and even the word demon itself comes from the Greek word daimon. Daimon, they tend to refer to spirits in Greek myth. They could be helpful, they could be evil, and in the same way, I feel like that's also fed our modern idea of demons. It's kind of give us an idea that yeah, they're sentient beings. They're probably not all exactly the same, and it's not just where we get the word.
Absolutely. And I feel like whenever we're talking about these kind of influences on how we see hell and how we see demons, I feel like we cannot not talk about Dante's Inferno and his circles of hell because there's so much of that when it comes to how modern people envision hell, that's what they're picturing is they're not picturing something from the Bible. They're not picturing something from the Torah or the Septuagint or even from the Quran. They're picturing Dante's Inferno.
Absolutely, Dante. Well, Dante technically he was Italian, but close enough. There's a lot of Greek influence in there that you see, like more Roman, but at one point Plutus is mentioned, I believe, in the Circle of Greed. Plutus, Pluto, however you want to say it. I don't know if you remember that section.
Oh, absolutely. We actually have him mention a lot of things because, like you said, he's Italian. Now, technically, it's worth mentioning he's medieval, so he's quite a bit after Rome and Greece. I mean, Rome and the place Rome and Greece existed, but when we generally say Rome, we mean the Roman Empire and we mean early Greece. So he's quite a bit after that. He's from the medieval era. Dante is. But he mentions a lot of things relating, like he actually has the fictional character of Odysseus from the Odyssey in his circle of hell. He basically has him in hell for being sneaky and dishonest because, of course, it was Odysseus who came up with the idea of winning the Trojan War by sneaking the soldiers in using the Trojan horse. And I find that so interesting that we have him, who is a medieval Catholic Italian, interpreting the Roman interpretation of a story that was originally written by Greeks because originally Odysseus was a hero and seen as a very good thing. The Romans hated him because he wasn't an upfront fighter and he saw problems by being clever, and they saw that as cowardly, and then turned that over to the medieval Catholics who saw him as even worse, so they threw Odysseus into hell.
That makes sense if you don't think about it. But yeah, as for Greek influence in Dante's Inferno, like you said, it's everywhere. Characters like Nessus, the centaur. So, the river Styx shows up, which is the river where dead souls travel in Greek mythology. Phlegethon shows up, and I believe that shows up in Greek myth. I just can't seem to remember it, but it's guarded by centaurs, which are very Greek things. One by the name of Nessus, which comes right from Greek mythology. And of course, he actually meets the ferryman, Charon, Charon. How do you say it?
I usually say Charon, but I am 100% sure I am incorrect because I used to say chimera for the word that is normally pronounced chimera. So I 100% know I'm wrong.
So it's probably Charon, and that sounds really close to Karen, which I don't care for. But if we pronounce it Charon, he meets Charon. He meets Minos. King Minos is down there. He's a divine judge. So until I don't want to dig too deep into this. The only other thing I want to mention is when he meets Plutus in the Greek circle, he's saying a phrase over and over again, and to this day, people have not figured out what it meant. It was in Latin. He says pape satan, alepe, and it's greatly debated as to what that means. What do you think it means?
I don't know Latin well enough. I'm definitely getting Satan the adversary vibes, but my Latin's not good enough to make a harder guess than that.
My Latin's not great, but I know that pape refers to father. You know what Satan means, of course. And alepe is number one or first. So a common belief is that he's saying, Father Satan, number one enemy of God, or something like that. But down in the comments, what do you guys think? I don't know if we're going to get a deep philosophical discussion about the Latin language, but it doesn't hurt to try.
And I think another really interesting thing to mention about Dante is that the concept of hell having circles and having different sections of where, depending on what your sin is, dictates where you go, that's original to Dante. That is not present in any other Christian, Jewish, or Islamic folklore until Dante came up with that. So that is purely Dante's invention. So if you ever meet a Christian who believes that hell has circles like Dante, they're basing their idea of what hell looks like on medieval Italian pop culture, not actual biblical anything.
Yeah, you know what else uses the circle idea? Because I have to keep making these connections back to it.
Gee, I'll never guess. Please enlighten me. What fiction could you possibly be trying to reference?
Well, Hell of a Boss and Has Been Hotel, of course. We don't have to go into a lot of detail, but I just want to connect that back as many times as possible because that is my favorite thing.
And I do realize that Has Been Hotel and Hell of a Boss have been a significant portion of this episode, and I apologize for nothing.
Yeah, me neither. But it is interesting how they kind of reuse the idea. Don't worry, I won't go on a big tangent here, but rather than just the idea, if you look at Dante's Inferno, his circles are very specific. Now, there are deadly sins there, but there are other things there too. It almost seems to me like almost like Vivzy Pop kind of scaled it back a little bit, and the rings just directly refer to deadly sins and nothing else, like, betrayal.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like that's back to what you said about how Pop keeps one foot in the folklore, but feels perfectly safe to just explore and do different things. So, whereas Dante had 9 circles of hell, Pop only uses 7 to represent the 7 deadly sins. And I love that, how that's still based in the circles of hell. It's still based in the 7 deadly sins. She's got a firm basis in things that actually existed, but feels safe to just run off in her own direction.
I do wonder if in a few hundred years, when humanity's rebuilding itself from whatever big thing is going to happen, if they will find this stuff and think of that as the new archetype for what hell is.
That is 100% going to happen. I am also 100% certain that some anthropologist in the future is going to look at internet memes and think that that is our pantheon of gods.
Oh God, Bad Luck Brian's going to be a god.
We seem to think that this was some sort of god or demon that represented ill fortune, but we're not quite sure what his place in the pantheon was. But we believe it was lower than Grumpy Cat, but higher than that one kid who made the victory pose.
Listen, nobody is above Grumpy Cat. All hell tartar sauce. I was actually legitimately sad when that cat died. I hate to say.
Weirdly, the death of social media animals affects all of us deeply.
That's true. But before we go too far into the weeds on this, I also want to mention another piece of important biblical fan fiction. Of course, Milton's Paradise Lost.
I feel like there's one thing that even if you're not familiar with who Milton is or what Paradise Lost is, which is of course a novel written by Milton, that you are familiar with one line from it, which is it is better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, and that is a line from the book.
Which is completely untrue, completely false. I cannot abide that. I want to be a king down there.
Well, that being the idea, it is better to rule in hell. You just want to be the one ruling in hell.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And it is going to happen. Mark my words. Are you marking them?
They have been duly marked. Whenever the second demonic rebellion occurs after Hatter's death, we will know that he is the cause.
Precisely. But, more important thing, one of the most important things to remember about Milton, not only that line, which is a complete lie, is the fact that the idea of Lucifer that we have now, this character, arguably seems to have come from that story. The archetype we have, anyway.
Well, and I think even, and I agree with that completely, but I think even more than the archetype is also the idea of a sympathetic Lucifer. We see it from him, we see it from Mark Twain, like we mentioned before with Letters from Earth. You see more of these are the stories that brought us the sympathetic Lucifer that then in the most modern reference does become back to Hell of a Boss and Has Been Hotel.
Everything comes back to Vivzy Pop.
Have you listeners, have you noticed that we happen to be fans of Izzy Pop? I'm not sure if you got that, so I just wanted to say it explicitly.
Yeah, I don't think we were clear enough on it. I'm glad you said that. But anyway, the final thought I have on Paradise Lost, yes, it is our original depiction of Lucifer, but I also want to kind of connect that to something that arguably may have come first. I don't know the exact timeline, guys. I'm sorry. I don't know everything. But if we go back to the Islamic writings, we have the character of Iblis or Shaitan. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation, and I apologize to any Islamic viewers. But Iblis was a similar idea. The basic idea was he didn't like something that God did, and he told him, I disagree with this, and he was cast out. Same basic idea, a lot more complicated, and we may get into it in the future. But do you have anything to add to that, Gray?
No, other than I do find it kind of interesting and worth mentioning to all the viewers out there that when you're considering the Abrahamic folklores and the different three Abrahamic religions, it's important to remember that the oldest is Judaism by far. Judaism came first. Then we had Christianity that came about, of course, in about 0 AD, that being the idea, and that Islam actually came about quite a bit after that. So we have to keep in mind that all Christian folklore is based on Jewish folklore, and that Islamic folklore is based on Christian and Jewish folklore. Now, when I say Islamic folklore is based on Christian and Jewish folklore, I don't mean the entirety of their folklore, because it's also based upon the individual folklores of the people that existed before they became Islamic. Just that their holy text and the stuff in their holy text is informed by these other two books that most Muslims will actually consider to be a valid text, even if they don't necessarily consider the religions that currently follow them to themselves be valid.
And let me just be clear one more time. We mentioned this earlier. We are not putting any more importance on any of these religions than the others. We're not saying one is derivative of the other. We're not saying one is more true than the others. We are just speaking of the folklore and the objective facts we have. We're not saying anybody's is more true than the others, right?
Absolutely. All of these religions are all influenced by each other, and that's just an objective fact. We are not saying, again, as you said, no one is more necessarily accurate than the other. No one is necessarily derivative, other than just you can't argue that if something happened while another thing existed, it was definitely influenced by it. Much like we were talking about how you cannot argue that Christianity is not influenced by Greek and Roman myth because it was happening at the same time. They influenced each other. Some of the people who came to believe one thing originally believed the other, and it's very unrealistic to think they wouldn't have carried those beliefs with them.
Now, of course, outside of those three subsets we were talking about today, there are other cultures that have things similar to demons. And I do think demons and monsters and gods outside of these three Abrahamic religions will be a future episode. What do you think, Gray?
Absolutely. We have to do a non-Abrahamic demon episode for sure because we have so many examples both in culture. So we have like our Russian demons, we have our Japanese demons, our Chinese demons, we have yokai, we have kitsune, we have all these really cool different non-Abrahamic demons in folklore. We have non-Abrahamic demons in media. Like one of the first things that comes to mind is the Cenobites from Hellraiser. And they're not exactly. I thought about kind of including them because technically they have a god called Leviathan, which technically does tie it back to the Bible, but that's a stretch, so we didn't go there. We also have the demons from Warhammer 40K, which are non-Abrahamic but are super cool.
Yeah, let's not forget, at one point, I believe this was in the first Hellraiser movie, Pinhead says, "We explore the further regions of experience, angels to some, demons to others." And I apologize, Doug Bradley, if you hear that. I didn't mean to disrespect with that god awful impression.
No, but for sure. I mean, I love them as a depiction of kind of angel, kind of demon, really almost more like just a. They almost fit more into cosmic horror in a way, which is really interesting. And we've definitely got to do a cosmic horror episode.
I wonder if we could get Doug Bradley to guest star on an episode.
Doug Bradley, if you're listening, we would love for you to come guest star on an episode.
But if I have to pick, if I have to pick a guest star and I have the choice between Vizzy Pop and anyone from Vizzy Pop and Doug Bradley, yeah, you already know what I'm picking.
I can take a wild guess.
Yeah, Santa Claus.
It's always Santa Claus. No matter what the question is, the answer is always Santa Claus.
And Santa Claus is an anagram for Satan.
And weirdly, that is 100% something I have heard real people argue.
It's really ridiculous out there. But anyway, folks, we have been going on for quite some time. I did want to talk a little bit about demons in D&D, but I think we should definitely save that for the non-Abrahamic ones because despite being based on Abrahamic demons, they're very different. They've got their own kind of cycle and folklore.
Oh, for sure. Because while they're really fascinating, they really have almost not they're not fallen angels. They have almost nothing to do with Abrahamic demons. Although one thing I will mention about them, why you should definitely stay tuned for the episode we do that features them, is they are one of the few things I have seen that makes a distinction between demons and devils in D&D. Devils are lawful evil and demons are chaotic evil, and I love that distinction, and we're going to go into that in a deep dive for sure in the episode that we do about them.
Absolutely. And I think a perfect way to tie this in a nice satanic knot, that wasn't as funny as I thought it would be, but moving on. What is your favorite depiction of Lucifer or Satan? Could be a movie, a book. What do you got?
You know, one of my favorite depictions of Satan from fiction is actually from Constantine, which, if people aren't familiar with that, that's a comic book all about this demonologist, magic worker type dude. That could have definitely gone here. We could have talked a lot about Constantine in this episode, but I think we're going to save him for horror in comic books because that's going to be the perfect place for Constantine. But specifically, I'm talking about the Constantine movie, which is very divisive. Not everybody liked it. I have my own feelings about it. We'll cover that when we get to it, but the depiction of the devil specifically from the Constantine movie, where he is almost coming to the rescue, but specifically whenever Constantine gets the chance to basically sacrifice himself, absolve himself of his sin, and go to heaven, the devil, who does not like Constantine and does not want him to win and go to heaven, saves his life and literally pulls the lung cancer out of his body so that he will live long enough to screw up and get himself damned back to hell. And more for that one act than anything else, using divine healing as a punishment, I'm going to say that's my favorite depiction of Satan.
It's definitely a good one. And let me say this, I did not like that movie because I was a fan of the comics before that, and I'm sure we can put two and two together as to why I didn't like the movie. But one thing I do like about Constantine, I'll be quick about this, is the idea that he takes the deal with the devil idea and uses his con man skills in the best way in the comics. He sold his soul to three powerful demons in hell. And when the time came for him to pay up, they were too busy fighting over who would get it. And similarly in the comic books, they saved his life and said, we'll wait and see who he goes to.
Which is absolutely something I love. So, Hatter, what is your favorite interpretation of Satan, Lucifer, or the devil in general?
Now, immediately you can probably guess what I was going to say, but I'm going to say something else because I've been saying Hell of a Boss Has Been Hotel this whole time.
I'm glad you're going to say something else. Otherwise, I think people were going to start suspecting you had some kind of Tourette's like tick where you just spontaneously had to mention Vizzy Pop every 25 seconds.
I don't think it's a tick, but I do have to mention Vizzy Pop at least once a day, or else I feel like I failed myself as a human being. We're going to go in two directions with this. If I'm going to pick my favorite scary devil, are you familiar with the book Blood Meridian?
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Okay, so people out there, I'm going to tell you just a very little brief thing about this because even here, where this is an adult channel, I hesitate to say a lot of the things that happen in that book. But it's the idea of a dark western, and the character, the judge or Judge Holden, kind of represents Lucifer. If you look at the book and compare it against the Paradise Lost, his story, his idea, and what he is are very similar to their idea of Lucifer. And I love an allegory like that. And really, honestly, it's the most disturbing book I've ever read in my life. I cannot say enough, folks. If you decide to read Blood Meridian, make sure you're ready for it. But my favorite, more lighthearted Lucifer, I'm gonna say, is probably I tend to like the Draculian Lucifer, but one of the funnier ones I've read, I really can't pick a favorite. So I'm gonna tell you one of the maybe unintentionally funny ones. Are you familiar with Clive Barker's Scarlet Gospels? I think I've told you a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Lucifer in that is depicted as a guy who just wants to be done with what he's doing. You know, he obviously rules over hell and all that. And he's just like, I am so sick of this. And many times he's tried to end himself as a result. And finally, at the end, he gets so fed up, he collapses all of hell onto himself just to be done with it. Now, I know that's like kind of dark and tragic, but in its own way, it's kind of unintentionally funny. And I apologize for anybody who hasn't read Scarlet Gospels who's planning to, and that might have been a spoiler, but it came out like 10 years ago. It's your own fault.
I think at this point we're safe on the spoilers for any book that old.
Yeah, but I'm sorry if that was a spoiler, but the book came out 9 years ago. If you were going to read it, you've read it already. But I think we're about ready to wrap up here. I think we have touched on some really good stuff.
Absolutely. I love the use of angels and demons and just these divine powers in one way or the other in all of fiction. They're some of my favorite stories, and it allows you to tell some really fascinating stories. And if you're, in case you're wondering of anything that you wanted to hear us talk about, one, let us know. Anything we missed, any great angel or demon depictions, drop them in the comments, send us an email, whatever you got to do, let us know. But also rest assured that we are going to be revisiting this. We are not done with the religious horror at all. Demons are going to come back, angels are going to come back, and the exorcisms can be an entire episode to itself.
Absolutely. And this is one of my favorite subjects, so I'm going to probably not allow this to be the only episode on it. But I think at this point, we have covered what we wanted to cover here.
So, everyone, thank you so much for joining us on Liminal Radio. I'm Greg.
And I'm Hatter. And I want to thank you once again for joining us on the Station Between Stations, where we explore the deepest rabbit holes in horror.